April 1914. A ship carrying 376 passengers arrives at the shores of Canada. They are not criminals. They are not invaders. They are British subjects, citizens of the same empire that rules Canada. Yet the moment they arrive, the government refuses to let them step onto the land. For 2 months, they remain trapped on the ocean, hungry, thirsty, watched by armed guards. But this is not just a story about immigration. This is the story of a ship that exposed the racism of an empire and ignited a fire that would fuel India's struggle for freedom. And what happened when those passengers finally returned home would become even more shocking. As the ship crossed the Pacific Ocean, passengers imagined a new life waiting on the horizon. What they did not know was that Canadian authorities were already preparing to stop them. And when the ship finally reached Vancouver, a confrontation began that would shock the world. The Komagata Maru dropped anchor in Vancouver's harbour on May the 23rd, 1914. Before the steamship's engines had cooled, Canadian officials moved in. Customs officers blocked every gangway. Armed police formed a cordon along the docks, sealing the passengers inside their own ship. From the decks, 376 men, Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, looked out at a city they could not reach. Some pressed against the rails, searching the shoreline for a sign of welcome. Instead, they saw uniformed guards, government launches circling, and crowds of onlookers gathering along the waterfront. No one was allowed to step ashore. Notices were handed up from the dock, citing regulations most could not read. The harbour log records that the ship was held offshore, and the city's press dispatches spread word of the standoff. For the passengers, the promise of a new beginning had turned in an instant into a prison at sea. The question echoed among them: why were British subjects, citizens of the empire, being treated as outsiders, denied the right to land? The law that trapped the Komagata Maru in Vancouver's harbour was crafted with careful ambiguity. On January 8, 1908, Canada issued an order in council under Section 38 of the Immigration Act, declaring that no immigrant could land unless they arrived by a continuous journey from their country of birth or citizenship, and held a through ticket purchased before departure. The regulation never mentioned race, yet it was impossible for Indian migrants to comply. Steamship lines offered no direct passage from India to Canada. Every route required stops in Hong Kong or Japan, turning the rule into a silent barrier. A second order, dated June 3, 1908, added a financial hurdle. Any immigrant of Asiatic race had to show at least $200 in cash, a sum 8 times higher than what was asked of most Europeans. Officials enforced these rules with rigid precision, denying entry on technicalities while insisting the law was fair. Behind the neutral language, the intent was clear. The regulation was used to exclude those deemed undesirable without ever naming them. In the hands of government, the regulation became a weapon, cloaked in legality but sharpened by prejudice. Gurdit Singh stood at the center of the Komagata Maru story, a Sikh entrepreneur from Punjab, hardened by years of business in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and determined to test the British Empire's promise of equal rights. He did not act alone. Singh pooled his savings, gathered loans from Sikh and Hindu merchants across Asia, and signed a charter agreement for a Japanese steamship. The cost was steep, tens of thousands of yen. But the stakes were higher, a direct challenge to a law designed to keep men like him out. The passenger list stretched across provinces and faiths. Among them, a young carpenter from Amritsar, boarded with dreams of steady work in Vancouver's mills. A father from Jalandhar brought his teenage son, hoping to build a future away from famine and debt. Each paid their share of the fare, trusting that the empire's word would hold. For 376 travelers, this was not just a journey across oceans. It was a claim, public and deliberate, to rights denied by silent barriers. The Komagata Maru sailed from Hong Kong, stopped in Shanghai and Yokohama, then pressed onward, carrying hope and defiance toward a distant shore. Aboard the Komagata Maru, days blurred into weeks. The ship, built for short voyages, was never meant to hold so many for so long. With 376 men confined to its decks, every inch became precious. The galley struggled to stretch dwindling supplies. Ration logs show meals cut to the bare minimum: boiled rice, lentils, sometimes only tea and bread. Water tanks, meant for a routine passage, ran low. Buckets were passed hand to hand, each man allowed only a cup. Hunger gnawed at the strongest. Children's voices faded, elders grew gaunt. Medical notes from the time record outbreaks of fever and skin infections. A single doctor, working with almost no medicine, tried to treat wounds and calm the sick. Requests for fresh provisions were answered with silence or delay. The air grew stale. Waste piled up below decks, and the stench drifted across the water. To keep order, passengers formed a committee organizing daily chores, prayers, and shifts to watch for signs of hope from the shore. Some tried to write letters home, but few messages got through. Each morning, men gathered at the rails, scanning the city for a signal that justice would come. Instead, they watched the guards, the gunboats, and the crowds who came to stare. For 2 months, the Komagata Maru was a world unto itself, a floating cage held fast by law and by fear. Every day spent waiting in the harbour deepened the sense of betrayal. The promise of equal rights had become a struggle for survival. Legal action became the last hope for the passengers trapped aboard the Komagata Maru. Munshi Singh, a farmer from Punjab, filed a petition for habeas corpus, arguing that, as British subjects, the men on board had the right to enter Canada. The case reached the British Columbia Court of Appeal in late June 1914. Lawyers pressed the court to look past the technicalities and see the injustice in the law's design. The government's counsel, however, insisted that the continuous journey regulation was a legitimate exercise of federal authority, carefully crafted to give the Minister of Immigration near total discretion. On June 30th, 1914, the judges delivered their decision. The court ruled in favor of the government. The written judgment declared the regulation intra vires, within the power of Parliament, and made clear that the courts would not question the motives behind it. The law's neutral language, the bench reasoned, was enough to shield it from challenge. The court would not weigh the fairness of the policy, only its legality. Press coverage the next day captured the mood. The Times columnist called the regulation draconian. Editorials debated whether the law's real aim was to keep out undesirable immigrants while pretending to uphold imperial equality. For the passengers, the ruling closed the door on every legal avenue. The government now held the power to act, with the courts standing aside. The fate of the Komagata Maru would be decided not by argument, but by force. On July 23, 1914, the standoff ended in a show of imperial force. The Royal Canadian Navy cruiser HMCS Rainbow, bristling with guns, steamed into position in Burrard Inlet. Its hull dwarfed the Komagata Maru, sending a message as clear as any spoken word. Commander Walter Jose delivered the government's final order to Gurjit Singh and the passengers. The ship must depart Canadian waters at once. Any refusal would be met with naval action. The ultimatum was not a negotiation. Only a handful, fewer than 24, were granted permission to remain in Canada. mostly students and a lone diplomat. For the rest, the empire's promise of equal rights collapsed under the threat of artillery. The cruiser's log records the precise timing of the directive, its officers prepared to fire if the order was ignored. The Komagata Maru, denied justice by the courts and now surrounded by steel, was forced to turn back. The power of the state had spoken, not through words or laws, but through the looming shadow of a warship. Before dawn on September 29, 1914, the Komagata Maru's journey ended in violence at Budge Budge, a muddy dock outside Calcutta. British colonial police, acting under orders from District Magistrate J.A.L. Swan, surrounded the exhausted passengers as they stepped ashore. Tension crackled through the humid air. The authorities, fearing sedition and revolution, moved to arrest the men en masse. Some passengers resisted, desperate to avoid another round of detention after months at sea. Without warning, police opened fire. 19 men fell where they stood, shot dead in the chaos. One more drowned in the rush to escape the bullets. 9 others collapsed, wounded and bleeding, as the crowd scattered. Over 200 were seized and marched away in chains, accused of conspiracy or unlawful assembly. The camp on the riverbank emptied under the shadow of rifles and bayonets. The news raced across Bengal and Punjab. The price of exclusion was written in blood. British subjects, denied dignity abroad, met with deadly force on their own soil. For survivors and families, the promise of empire had ended at gunpoint, leaving only grief and a sense of betrayal that would echo for generations. The promise of equal citizenship shattered on Vancouver's shore still echoes today. Borders may shift, but the fight for dignity and justice persists. Discrimination cloaked in law endures in new forms. The question remains, who decides who belongs? History demands we answer, this time without turning anyone away.